Thank you for joining me in the first of the Rewired Relationship series. This morning, I want to talk about our love for ourselves. But before I do that, I want to remind us that one of the most difficult things about being human is dealing with our loneliness. We were born alone. We live alone all of our lives, and ultimately we die alone. And we may have loved ones all around us, but if we face a disease, if we face a terminal illness, it is us alone who must go through that journey. And I want to talk to you about how Africa, and in particular one day in Africa, completely changed my perception of loneliness, but most important, how I found a solution to my personal loneliness, and how I was able to understand a critical foundation of loving myself by loving others. Now, almost 10 years ago, I took my first trip to Africa, and I'm going to tell you that particular trip, it was a very, very difficult time in my life. I was like the writer of Ecclesiastes. Everything in my life felt meaningless, and I was in a deep depression, and I was taking high blood pressure medicine. I was trying to make any sense whatsoever of my life. I'd accomplished so much, and it seemed to mean nothing. My trip to Africa, it was kind of an accident. I was just filling in for a missions team, and they needed one more person, and we flew into Johannesburg, South Africa. We got on a bus, and the bus took 12, 14 hours to get to a Bible college. And this Bible college was in the middle of a shanty town of 300,000-400,000 people, and it was barbed wire all around, and we slept a couple of hours, and then we started with a devotion. Well, I don't remember much about the devotion, but what I do remember is at the end of the devotion, there was a man named Manny Ahome. And he was this huge Nigerian man, and he walked over to me, and he looked at me, and he said, "God just told me that you're about to be messed up." Well, sure enough, 3 days later, our group went to a banana plantation. And there was a feedlot there that the rich man had given so that 400 orphans, as a result of the AIDS epidemic in Africa, 400 orphans was in this feedlot, this barbed wire feedlot. And I kept asking the grannies who were taking care of them, what are their names? What's the name of these children? None of these children had names. And in particular, I was drawn to a corner of the lot. And this is where about 52-year-old children or younger, they were playing in this cholera, mosquito, bacteria-infested mud puddles, and they could no longer cry. And there was one child that was sitting in the corner. And the child sitting in the corner obviously had full-blown AIDS, had tuberculosis. His eyes were so yellow that you could hardly see the pupils. And I remember looking at that child and going, I cannot pick that child up. I'll get tuberculosis. I will take that home. And I heard, for the first and only time in my life, what I believe to be the voice of God. And I heard a voice that said, "Who are you?" And that reminded me that I was God's arms, and I was God's hands, and I was God's worker in the situation. And that child was loved by God, and I was to love that child. then I heard, "Whose are you?" Now the "whose are you" was to remind me that I was connected to that child through the family of humanity in ways that I couldn't even possibly imagine. At that moment, I reached down and picked the child up, and I began to sing the lullaby that my mom sang to me, "Bye, oh baby, oh bye." And that child looked at me, and for the first and only time in my life, I saw the face of God. Now, what that moment taught me, that the only way I, as a human, could find a solution to my loneliness was to love others. And to love others like this child without expecting anything in return. And if I loved the world, if I loved others in that way, God would give love back in ways that I couldn't even imagine. And that would be ultimately the solution to my loneliness. Africa reminded me of the most important lesson that I could ever learn. And that lesson is that if I love others without expecting anything in return, God will give love back to me. And I won't be lonely anymore. I'll be joyful and I'll be happy. So as we end today, the key to self-love, ironically enough, is loving others. And if we love others, we get love back. And once we discover that universal first principle, that universal truth, our life is so much better. Now, it's not perfect because we have to build on other things that I'm going to get to in the next few weeks. But the key to self-love is loving others without expecting anything in return.